Welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 41A, The Gallic Wars. At the end of last week, Caesar had succeeded in immunizing himself from prosecution by securing a proconsulship in Cisalpine Gaul for a period of 5 years. Over the course of his career, he had ignored tradition, law, morality, and good taste, and his enemies in the Senate were salivating at the opportunity to see him in court. Caesar was guilty as sin of the charges that would be brought against him as soon as he left public office, so for the sake of his career, and possibly his life, it was imperative that he never return to Rome as a private citizen. As we will see, it was this legal axe hanging over his head as much as anything else that led him to cross the Rubicon in that fateful year of 49 BC. But that was still a decade away. Now, in the year 58 BC, Caesar took over the governorship of Gaul, setting the stage for one of the most famous military campaigns in history. And not to take anything away from the skill and daring Caesar displayed while in Gaul, but the real reason the Gallic Wars are so famous is because Caesar wanted them to be famous. The thing that really shines through, more than his tactical ability or engineering accomplishments or strategic vision, was his brilliant flair for propaganda. Caesar was the unparalleled master of self-promotion. That his commentaries on the war in Gaul is still a required reading for Latin language courses today speaks for itself. At the time Caesar took control of Cis and Transalpine Gaul, the land north of the Mediterranean basin was, from the Roman perspective, an uncivilized land populated by barbaric tribes. But civilized is a relative term, and though to Roman eyes the Gauls were, quote, uncivilized, this does not mean that they were mindless brutes. True, there was no centralized government, and the basic political unit was still the tribe. But there were towns, craftsmen, religion, money, ornamentation, literacy, and political intrigue. I think the proper analogy here is the European arrival in the New World. The native Indians were dismissed as primitive by the civilized Europeans, but I think anyone who takes even a cursory glance at the workings of, say, the Iroquois Confederacy would be hard-pressed to argue that there was not a sophisticated civilization at work prior to the arrival of Western settlers. The same is true of the Gauls. To the average clean-shaven Roman, the long-haired Gaul must have seemed like something out of a primordial nightmare, but I think that there was a lot less separating them than either side would have cared to admit. Independent Gaul encompassed what is today France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and parts of Switzerland. The Romans controlled the southernmost territory in the Mediterranean basin, but since their days of initial expansion during the Punic Wars, they had shown little interest in moving north and seemed content to simply control the land route to the rich province of Hispania. In the east, Gaul was understood to end at the Rhine River, across which lay Germania. The relationship between the Gauls, the Germans, and who's doing what on whose side of the Rhine will be of great importance not only to the unfolding Gallic Wars, but for the rest of Roman history, as the Rhine River will eventually stand as the official border of the Roman Empire. In 58 BC, the Helvetii, a Celtic tribe who lived around Lake Geneva, grew tired of dealing with the encroaching German tribes. They decided to pack up their entire civilization and move out of the mountains, intent on resettling in lowland Gaul. According to master of propaganda Caesar, the Helvetii numbered somewhere north of 350,000, with roughly 100,000 of those being able-bodied men. Their total number was probably more like 100 to 150,000, with 30 to 50,000 being able-bodied men. Not quite the vast horde Caesar makes them out to be, but still large enough to be a terrible menace to the tribes they would transplant when they arrived to build their new home. They moved down through a valley until they arrived at the border of Transalpine Gaul, which they hoped to pass through so as to avoid moving through Free Gaul, which was full of tribes who had no interest in the Helvetii migrating into their lands. At this point, they sent envoys to meet Caesar and request safe passage through Roman territory. Caesar agreed to consider the request and asked for the envoys to return at a later specified date to receive an answer. But Caesar had no intention of letting the Helvetii pass and was simply stalling for time while he gathered his legions and built a huge fortified wall from one end of the narrow valley to the other. When the Helvetan envoys returned, the giant wall they ran into spoke for itself. Caesar's answer was no. There is no doubt that from the very beginning of his governorship, Caesar was looking for any opportunity to exploit perceived belligerence as an excuse to invade Greater Gaul. The Helvetan migration was simply the first opportunity that presented itself, and Caesar wasn't going to pass up an excuse to pick a fight. For the record, there was probably a real concern that the Helvetians of power in the region, and as governor of the neighboring province, Caesar had an interest in keeping the region stable. But you get the feeling that the Helvetii could have been looking for a place to plant a nice flower garden to brighten everyone's day, and Caesar still would have poked them in the eye with a stick. The Helvetii, though, were not looking for a place to plant a nice flower garden. They were warriors through and through, and reacted the way warriors react when someone pokes them in the eye with a stick. They attacked. But the Roman engineers had done their job with the fortifications, and the legionaries did their job with the fighting, and the Helvetii were easily repulsed. So the migrating Celts had no choice but to head north and pass through hostile Gallic territory. Caesar quickly returned to the Italian side of the Alps, picked up 3 legions he had in reserve, and raised 2 more from the local population. When the Helvetii spilled into Gaul, Caesar would be ready in case the call for aid arrived. Right on cue, an allied tribe ransacked by the incoming Helvetii sent a mission to beg the Romans for aid. They found Caesar more than willing to help his poor beleaguered allies drive off the nasty Helvetii. Were the allied tribes asking for his legions to march into their territory? Yes, the missions replied. Intervention formally requested, Caesar had his legal cover. The Roman invasion of Gaul had begun. Caesar caught up with the Helvetii as they crossed what is today the Saône River, near the border between Switzerland and France. He waited while 3/4 of the Celts were across the river, and then, with only 25% left on the east bank, charged in and attacked, annihilating the far smaller group while their comrades watched on from the far bank. The Helvetans were incensed at this cowardly move. Their sense of honor demanded open conflict between 2 armies, with lots of opportunities for individual bravery. They did not understand an enemy that would intentionally launch a surprise attack against a much weaker force. They drew the conclusion that the Romans were afraid of facing the full Helvetan army. They should have drawn the conclusion that Caesar didn't care a whit about Celtic honor. He was just going to systematically destroy them. With the bulk of the Helvetans, though, now loose in Greater Gaul, Caesar knew he would not be able to simply pick around the edges for long. He followed the Helvetii into modern France, but in doing so, made a strategic decision that would come back to haunt him. In order to stay mobile during the invasion, Caesar decided to forego establishing a secure supply line back to Roman territory. Instead, he intended to live off the land, and off the supplies he demanded from his Gallic allies. This was a risky decision that very nearly ended the invasion before it really began. See, not all the Gallic tribes, not even the tribes technically allied with Rome, were super excited about a Roman army rampaging around their territory. Not only was it dangerous in the immediate sense that the legions would eat them out of house and home, but it was dangerous in the longer-term sense that Rome might get comfortable with the idea that free Gaul lived to serve them. So Caesar's requests for supplies got lost in the mail, or were mistranslated, or couldn't be met because we've had a bad harvest. We'll get you what we can on Thursday. Oh, no, we mean next Thursday. It didn't take long for Caesar to realize he was being jerked around, and that he was now deep in enemy territory without anything to eat. So he abandoned his pursuit of the Helvetii and made for Biberacte, a fortified allied town in modern Burgundy. The Helvetii got wind of the Roman plight and turned around, the hunted now becoming the hunter. The Romans barely won the race to Biberacte, with the Helvetii cavalry harassing their rear as they approached the town. There turned out to be no time to actually even enter the fort, as the Helvetii smelled blood in the water and pressed an immediate attack. Both sides secured their baggage trains, and on the 20th of June, launched themselves at each other. A full day's fighting, with the outcome forever in doubt, finally gave way to night, as the Romans slowly, methodically, gained the upper hand. The Helvetii, and the Gauls, Celts, and Germans generally, knew of no other way to fight than charge en masse and engage in one-on-one fighting. How else could a warrior distinguish himself and earn the kind of glory so prized by his tribesmen? The Romans, on the other hand, fought in their maniple units, never breaking ranks and working with ruthless mechanical efficiency. It was infuriating to the tribes and a major source of their contempt that they felt towards the Romans. But at the end of a long day, when the Helvetii were exhausted, the legions kept pressing forward. Finally, they broke through and captured the Celtic baggage train. And when you have uprooted your entire civilization and packed it all into a baggage train, the capture of said train means that you have lost everything. The remains of the Helvetii, the women and children, the injured fighters, fled the field. Caesar's legions were so exhausted and had so many dead to bury that they were unable to take up pursuit for 3 days. But Caesar sent riders out to all the local tribes, threatening dire consequences for anyone who helped the Helvetii fugitives. When they were recovered, the legions set off after the survivors, quickly catching up with what was left of the great Celtic tribe. Those who had survived fell on their knees and begged for clemency. Caesar spared their lives, ordering them to return to Lake Geneva, where they were to remain, serving as a buffer between Roman territory and the forever encroaching Germanic tribes. With no recourse, the Helvetii agreed. Caesar's first major test as a general was a complete success. But he did not have long to bask in the glow of victory, because, speaking of encroaching German tribes, a German tribe was pouring across the Rhine, threatening to overrun the entire country. While Caesar was beating back the Helvetii, political struggles between native Gallic tribes had led one side to call on their cousins across the Rhine to help them out. They knocked on the door of Ariovistus, a great German leader who was more than happy to have an excuse to bring his 100,000-odd troops into Gaul. The tribe that had called him assumed Ariovistus would help them defeat their enemies and then leave. Ariovistus thought Gaul a nice place to rule, and he turned ruthlessly on nominal Gallic ally and nominal Gallic foe alike. This forced both sides of the internal Gallic struggle to turn to the Romans for aid. And this was a somewhat tricky situation for Caesar, as Ariovistus had already made diplomatic contact with Rome, and, with Caesar's support no less, been declared a friend of the Romans. But that did not give the German king carte blanche, and Caesar was already considering Gaul his own personal backyard, where the Germans were camped. At this point, Caesar was just coming off an extremely hard-fought battle with the Helvetii, and was in no mood to take on a huge and fresh German army. So his intention was to convince Ariovistus to withdraw back across the Rhine, or at the very least, prevent any more Germans from coming into Gaul. Caesar sent envoys ahead asking for a meeting, but the German king would have none of it. So Caesar sent a note containing the provisions by which the Germans would be allowed to stay in Gaul. No more Germans could cross the river, any Gallic hostages the Germans held must be returned, and they must agree to not make war on any native Gallic tribe. Ariovistus scoffed at these terms, and replied incredulously that it was rich for a Roman general to be making demands so far from his home. If Caesar wanted to force the issue, he was more than welcome to try. While this back and forth was taking place, ever more Germans were invading across the Rhine, and calls for help were coming down from the local Gauls. Caesar knew he had to put a stop to the invasion. His legions could certainly stand to be outnumbered in battle, but there was a practical limit to what they could match. So Caesar moved north through the dense forest west of the Rhine to close the spigot. Marching for days through trees so tightly packed the sun disappeared toward an enemy that was amongst the most feared in the ancient world, the legionnaires' nerves began to waver. With each passing day, stories passed through the ranks about the Germans took on a life of their own, until the average foot soldier was convinced that Caesar was marching them to face 15-foot-tall cannibals who breathed fire and used black magic to curse their enemies. Caesar nipped this brewing mutiny in the bud by convening a meeting of his centurions, the veteran soldiers who led the men day to day, in camp and